Now, Jessica, I know that you are going to have a conversation with us. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Sarah, and thanks so much to Rodrigo, Isabel, Mark, and the SEG students for these genuinely fascinating presentations and insights. Definitely lots of food for thought. And thanks for everyone for joining today's session. So, as Sarah mentioned right at the start, I'm a strategic advisor specialising in critical minerals traceability, supply chain transparency, and digital product passports. And I've been working across these fields in sustainability strategy, public policy, and digital solutions over the last 10 years, helping organisations to build more resilient and circular value chains while also strengthening their international collaboration, which is going to be a kind of key theme of my kind of talk today. I'm very focused on the evolving landscape of policies, standards, as well as the digital tools. So it's kind of what I will spend the next 10 minutes focused on. Sarah also mentioned that previously I was Deputy Director of Affairs at Circulor, who are one of the kind of leading supply chain traceability and digital product passport solution providers, where I led communications, regulatory engagement, and partnerships. So we'll bring some of that to today's discussion. And I guess lastly, just to say, like, it's a real pleasure to be here at the seventh Responsible Raw Materials Conference, which brings together this real fantastic community of people working collectively in our specific areas to advance responsible and sustainable raw materials. Yeah, it's a really inspiring session. So yeah, thanks again. Um, I guess I'll kind of kick off, building on some of the points that Mark made right at the start around where we're sitting today, when it comes to critical raw materials. And as we're all very aware, as the global demand for critical raw materials accelerates, which is driven by, yes, the energy transition, electrified mobility, and also advanced manufacturing. The need for resilient, transparent, and circular value chains has never been more urgent. And, today more than ever, that's very apparent. So yeah, I'm going to share my perspectives on the journey that we're on from kind of uncertainty to not necessarily certainty, but definitely more transparent, responsible, and circular mineral value chains at scale. So to talk through this journey, I kind of break us down into three sessions, three areas, so that I'm not using slides. So firstly, I'll talk about some of the policy developments, which are really setting the direction of travel, and the ambitions that we work towards. Then I'll talk about some of the digital tools that help us make compliance and circularity actually feasibly possible by enabling effective tracking, verification, and use of critical materials. And then I'll spend a bit of time talking about the increasing role of standards that will underpin policies and also create global alignment. But what I will do throughout is talk about why it's the interaction between these three areas that creates more certainty about where we're sourcing from, what's expected from industry, and ultimately then how we need to drive real change. So, firstly, looking at the kind of policy developments, and when I think about this topic, it's hard to know where to begin, really. The policy landscape in 2025 was definitely defined by uncertainty, and that's not just for public affairs and policy professionals. I think the impact of new administration, deregulation, and changes to policy proposals has really been felt across businesses and across functions. And that's particularly the case when it comes to critical raw materials. To Mark's point earlier on, energy security and, what we've just heard from Rodrigo. The reason why critical raw materials are so important in this conversation is because they are mined and processed, refined and recycled across multiple jurisdictions, often with significant dependencies, excuse me, on a small number of supply countries. And this is creating huge risk when it comes to geopolitical tension, trade restrictions, and market volatilities. Looking at rare earths is a good example of kind of the most recent challenge or casualty in all of this. But at the same time, and equally important, the environmental and social impacts associated with raw materials have much needed heightened scrutiny, from regulators, from investors, and broader civil society, including ourselves. So, as a result of all of this, major economies have we've seen a clear shift in terms of what the governments are requiring. It's no longer about encouraging transparency in where materials are sourced and circularity. They are now requiring it. And whether that's through industrial policies or industrial strategies, due diligence obligations, or product transparency requirements, for example, Europe's batteries regulation kind of being a key lighthouse policy. But looking at the UK, as many of us are very well aware, the Critical Raw Materials Strategy was published in November last year. And there's probably various views among us in terms of the importance of that. But for me, it does represent an important step towards securing a resilient supply of raw materials in the face of growing global competition and supply chain risks. The strategy focuses on building domestic capability and cultivating midstream processing and recycling, which is of course key for the UK, but also looking at where and how to strengthen international supply networks. It also, for the first time, introduces growth minerals list and outlines coordinated responses to potential market disruptions. Although I think, yeah, maybe more action and traction is needed in some of that, which is very topical right now. What the strategy does well, I guess, from my perspective, is that in order to measure progress, it establishes targets and benchmarks. So these include things around meeting 10% of annual UK demand for critical minerals through domestic production and 20% through recycling and materials recovery by 2035. And also importantly, it looks at key value chains. So value chains for batteries, rare earth elements, and defence, requiring these to be increasingly diversified with no more than 60% of the UK's demand to be supplied by a single country. And while this is a really important ambition, it requires significant changes to today's supply chains. We cannot be naive about that. So looking a little bit more broadly, I guess, then the UK's objectives for the critical mineral strategy align closely with Europe's Critical Raw Materials Act, which was introduced in May 2024, as well as Europe's recently adopted Repower EU and the Industrial Accelerator Act, which are all aiming to reduce strategic dependencies and strengthen domestic supply chains. Repower EU, just to give you some kind of specifics, it aims to cut dependency on single third country sources by up to 50% for these key value chains, again, looking at batteries, rare earth elements, and defence, as well as requiring stronger conditions on sourcing materials in Europe or from trusted partners to be eligible for innovation funds, so essentially public funding, as well as a renewed kind of push on price floors. It also introduces measures on the exports of scrap and waste of permanent magnets and aluminium scrap to support recycling scaling in Europe. I guess kind of even further afield, looking at other countries, and some of these countries have also been named throughout other presentations today, but the likes of Australia, Canada, Japan, and India have all introduced critical raw materials policies that aim to increase financing. They introduce tax incentives as well as recycling support and driving innovation. But in addition to these policies, we also have global initiatives such as the G7 Critical Minerals Action Plan, the Mineral Security Partnership, and the work of the International Energy Agency, for example, that are increasingly shaping approaches to responsible and resilient mineral supply chains. The G7 Critical Minerals Action Plan, for example, focuses on building responsible and transparent markets. It promotes investment and fosters innovation. And one of its central commitments is looking to develop a standards-based market for critical minerals that reflects the real cost of responsible extraction, processing, and trading, and looks at how to strengthen traceability as a necessary measure. And I will talk about traceability more shortly. But I hope kind of that what that kind of helps to paint the picture of is that across these different jurisdictions, they're moving at different speeds. There's different requirements, there's different thresholds and different reporting expectations, which creates uncertainty. So while policy is essential in setting the direction and creating momentum on its own, it cannot deliver outcomes. So how are we, industry, and the ecosystem responding to that complexity? And that kind of brings me on to digital enablers or digital tools. So, from my perspective, at the heart of the transparency transformation lies a growing ecosystem of digital enablers that really reshape how materials are tracked, verified, and circulated really across global supply chains, with digital traceability solutions emerging as foundational tools that provide visibility into material flows across the life cycle, and they provide the data infrastructure needed to support circularity. Traceability data and traceability solutions allow stakeholders to verify the provenance and origin of their materials, as well as assess the environmental and social impacts, and of course, meet evolving regulatory requirements. A landmark development, as I'm sure many people are aware, is the Digital Product Passport, the DPP, which provides structured, accessible, and verified data on material origins, life cycle impacts, and product performance. Batteries, of course, are the first product group that will have to have digital product passports, closely followed by broader electronics and also intermediary materials like iron and steel and aluminium. And DPPs are increasingly seen as this critical tool to providing the data needed to enable effective reuse, remanufacturing of materials. I think kind of Sarah mentioned this, really well in the introduction. Recycling has to be the end goal, and that needs to be as far out as possible. Really, the objective is to ensure that products, components stay in life for as long as possible. And digital product passports, for example, the data on material and chemical composition provide details on recycled content, materials, and the presence of substances of concern, e.g., kind of hazardous materials, which will ultimately improve the safety and efficiency of dismantling of products and components. However, digital product passports, as great as they are, their effectiveness depends on cross-border interoperable solutions because it's no longer just about moving materials between jurisdictions. We're also talking about moving data between jurisdictions. A paper that was published last year, and I'll just pop it in the chat. I found it particularly interesting. It was published by the UNECE. It finds that major economies like Europe, US, and China are developing DPP systems that are not interoperable, i.e., data cannot be shared and understood effectively. And this lack of interoperability creates confusion, it creates compliance costs for businesses, and potentially sidelines smaller operators and developing nations. So for me, the kind of question then is why is that happening? Why are we seeing these solutions being developed in kind of silos? And I think the answer really lies when we look at the policy landscape, where there are oh, thanks, Sarah. Where there are patchworks of policies being developed, and there's not enough efforts in terms of harmonizing with what other countries are looking to do. So, you know, the other thing that I'm seeing is ultimately when digital enablers or digital tools become the goal in themselves, and this is a real risk, right? Because if they become the goal, it actually risks undermining the very kind of sustainability and supply chain resilience objectives that they're meant to serve. So we really need to be thinking about how to harmonize and align solutions when delivering and implementing them at scale. And that's really how we will create transparency across global supply chains. Sorry. So just lastly, then coming on to the policies, so it's to the standards, and if kind of policy is telling us what is required, sets the ambition and the direction, and digital tools are providing us with the tools to actually to do that. Standards play an increasing role in defining the how. How do we actually do that? And I kind of like to look at standards as more of a connective tissue between the policies and the tools. They will improve interoperability and comparability as well as trust across borders and across different systems. I guess standards also are maybe, one of the kind of lesser known areas, but there's been huge amounts of progress in kind of core standards that directly support transparency and traceability of critical minerals. Just to name a few quickly in the interest of time, things like the ISO 289 on rare earths, which is looking to advance standards to establish traceability approaches for rare earth elements. as well as ISO 323 on the circular economy, which is developing standards to provide guidance on sustainable recovery of secondary materials. And then organisations like IEC, the TC11, which is talking about environmental standardization for electrical products. And all of these are key in terms of providing the granular frameworks and requirements to drive transparency, sustainability, and circularity. As I mentioned earlier on digital product passports, there are standards being developed to facilitate interoperability between supply chains and between digital product passports themselves, with 8 standards being developed by JTC 24 through the European Union's CEN-CENELAC, which is a joint technical committee on digital product passports. This will include standards and rules on unique identifiers, access rights to the data, data storage, as well as data exchange protocols. And these will be really key in terms of effective digital product passports. In addition, you've got the emergence of the UN Transparency Protocol, UNTP. Again, it's a voluntary standard, open and technology neutral interoperability framework that aims to establish a common language for ESG and traceability data exchange across borders. And it's these kinds of initiatives that are going to really bring some of the digital solutions and therefore the policies to successful delivery. However, much like the policy landscape, the standards landscape is also fragmented, and there is low awareness of highly relevant formal standards because there is so much there. Some standards have particularly onerous specifications for SMEs, and the cost of implementation of certain standards can be very high. So, you know, to kind of finish off my section on standards, while they do provide common frameworks that facilitate coordination and implementation, they have limited market impact unless they're supported by clear policy incentives. So there is a real growing need for coordination across regions to avoid a patchwork of standards. And I guess bringing in some, lessons learned or reflections, particularly looking at the batteries value chain, where practices like designing for assembly or standardized data collection may not be immediately attractive to manufacturers or operators, regulations like the batteries regulation are essential to encourage adoption of these approaches. So just aware of time, so I will just kind of close out there. But before I do, I just want to reiterate that increasing certainty comes from interactions and alignment across these three areas: policy, digital enablers, and standards. Progress in specific silos will not lead to the kind of transformational changes that we need in today's value chains.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jessica. Round of applause, everybody, for the fantastic Jessica Green. And yeah, wise words, I think, as someone who also spends their lives in the depths of the, I think Francis Wall once described it as this forest of standards, and nobody can actually see the trees for what on earth is going on round about. Brilliant. Thanks, Jessica. And sorry, on you go. You want
No, I was just going to say, actually, the British Standards Institute published earlier this year, last month, a kind of standards landscape tool, which actually looks at some of these standards across the traceability, circularity. So I'll also post that in the chat for those that are interested. There are many in there, unsurprisingly, but I think it's a useful tool in terms of mapping the outcomes that you're looking for as an organisation with what's been developed.
Yeah, no, that's incredibly useful. And I think your very succinct summary of the different component parts that are here, as well as a lot of the recent evolutions and developments, was fantastic. So thank you very much, Jessica. Round of applause. Brilliant.